The diplomatic station orbiting Meridian's reach looked impressive from the outside, all gleaming metal and diplomatic optimism. From the inside, however, it resembled what you'd get if someone asked a committee of bureaucrats to design a space station while actively trying to make everyone as uncomfortable as possible. Before we begin, YouTube shows me that 93% of you haven't subscribed yet. Subscribing is free, it really supports our community, and I'd love for you to be part of it. Also, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. The conference room where humanity's first formal peace negotiations with the Solareth Empire were taking place had all the warmth and charm of a morgue, which, considering how things were going, seemed oddly appropriate. Dr. Nia sat at the human side of the negotiation table, watching the proceedings with the kind of fascination usually reserved for particularly gruesome traffic accidents. As the delegation's xenobiologist, a fancy way of saying she was the only human crazy enough to have spent months studying 8-foot-tall apex predators who could disembowel her without breaking stride, she wasn't technically supposed to be doing any actual negotiating. Her job was to sit quietly, take notes, and occasionally whisper helpful observations like, "When his ears flatten like that, he's contemplating whether you'd taste better roasted or raw." Unfortunately, nobody had bothered to explain this arrangement to War Prime Gorth, who kept directing his increasingly hostile attention toward her instead of Ambassador Fletcher. This was probably because Fletcher had the diplomatic skills of a brick and the cultural sensitivity of a thermonuclear weapon, but Gorth didn't seem particularly interested in making that distinction. "Your species," Gorth rumbled, his massive frame making the reinforced chair creak ominously, "claims to seek peace. Yet you send warriors disguised as scholars." His golden eyes fixed on Nia with the intensity of someone trying to solve a particularly irritating puzzle. "This one bears the scent of our kind. She has walked among us." Nia glanced at Fletcher, who was doing his best impression of a deer caught in headlights, then back at Gorth. "That's because I spent 8 months on Solareth Prime studying your people's social structures and behavioral patterns," she said, keeping her voice level. "It's called research. Humans do it before making important decisions. Novel concept, I know." The War Prime's ears twitched, which, according to Nia's notes, indicated either amusement or the preliminary stages of homicidal rage. With Solareth, it was often difficult to tell the difference. Fletcher cleared his throat nervously. "What Dr. Nia means to say is that we value scientific understanding as a foundation for mutual cooperation." Silence. Gorth's voice carried the kind of authority that made small planets reconsider their orbital patterns. "I was not speaking to you, Fletcher of the soft words and empty promises. I speak to the one who has earned the right to be heard." Nia felt a headache building behind her eyes. This was exactly what she'd warned the diplomatic corps about in her preliminary reports, which they'd presumably used as drink coasters. Solareth culture placed enormous emphasis on personal achievement and direct action. They respected strength, courage, and competence. Sending a career politician to negotiate with them was like trying to put out a fire with gasoline-soaked kindling. "War Prime," she said carefully, "with respect, I'm not here as a negotiator. I'm here to provide cultural context and scientific expertise. Ambassador Fletcher represents the United Human Coalition in these discussions." Gorth's laugh sounded like a landslide with a sense of humor. "Your Fletcher represents nothing but the weakness of a species that sends others to speak for them. You, scholar who walks with predators, you have value. The rest." He gestured dismissively with one clawed hand, nearly knocking over a water pitcher in the process. The negotiations had been going like this for 3 days now. Fletcher would make a carefully worded proposal. Gorth would ignore him completely and address his responses to Naya. And she'd find herself reluctantly translating between a diplomat who couldn't understand that his opponent viewed him as fundamentally beneath notice, and a warrior philosopher who considered the entire human race to be disappointingly fragile. The really fun part, and by fun, Nia meant soul-crushingly frustrating, was that Gorth had brought his cubs. 5 adolescent Solarith, each roughly the size of a Great Dane, with the temperament of a caffeinated wolverine, currently housed in the station's nursery wing. It was meant as a gesture of trust and good faith, proof that the Solarith delegation came in peace. The cubs were Gorth's own offspring, and bringing them to negotiations was the Solarith equivalent of a diplomatic handshake. Of course, nobody had bothered to mention this to the station staff until after the cubs had already chewed through most of the nursery's furniture and established a complex territorial hierarchy that involved marking various bulkheads with what Nia really hoped was just saliva. "Perhaps," Fletcher said, consulting his notes with the desperate air of someone clinging to a procedural life raft, "we could discuss the proposed trade agreements." Section 4, subsection 12, specifically addresses... The lights went out. For a moment, the only sound in the conference room was the gentle hum of life support systems and Fletcher's slightly panicked breathing. Then the emergency lighting kicked in, bathing everything in an ominous red glow that made Gorth look even more intimidating than usual, which was quite an achievement. "Well," Nia muttered, "that's not ominous at all." The station's communication system crackled to life with the voice of Commander Willis, the station's chief operations officer. "All personnel, we are experiencing a cascade failure in the primary power core. This is not a drill. All non-essential personnel report to designated evacuation stations immediately. Repeat, this is not a drill." Gorth rose from his chair with fluid grace, instantly alert. "Your den burns, softskins. Where are my cubs?" Fletcher was frantically tapping his wrist communicator. "I'm sure it's just a precautionary measure. These stations have multiple redundancy systems." "Nursery Wing, Section 12. Nia answered Gorth directly, already moving toward the door. "Commander Willis, what's the status of Section 12? The reply came through gritted teeth. "Section 12 is complicated. We've got structural fires, and the automated lockdown protocols have engaged. We're working on it." The blood drained from Fletcher's face as the implications sank in. Nia felt her stomach drop as her scientific mind automatically began calculating survival probabilities and coming up with numbers she really didn't like. Gorth's expression shifted into something that belonged on the face of an apex predator whose offspring were in danger. It was the kind of look that made sensible prey animals reconsider their life choices and start updating their wills. "How long?" he asked, his voice carrying undertones that suggested the answer had better be measured in minutes, not hours. Commander Willis's voice came back tight with stress. "Unknown. The fire suppression systems in that section aren't responding, and we've got structural damage blocking the primary access routes. We're mobilizing emergency teams, but nothing," Gorth snarled. "My cubs are trapped in your burning den. I go to them now." He moved toward the door with the kind of determined stride that suggested he planned to walk through any obstacles, regardless of their structural integrity or combustibility. Nia found herself moving to intercept him, which was either very brave or very stupid. Given her track record, it was probably both. "Wait," she said, placing herself between the War Prime and the exit. "You can't just charge in there. If the lockdown protocols are active, the corridors could be flooded with toxic gases or superheated plasma. Even with your enhanced physiology. I am Solarith, Gorth interrupted, looming over her like a furry mountain of barely contained violence. We do not abandon our young to fire and fear. And I am a xenobiologist, with an unfortunately functioning brain, Nia shot back, which means I know that getting yourself killed won't save them. We need information first. Commander Willis, what exactly are we dealing with? The commander's response painted a picture that was somehow worse than Nia had feared, which was quite an achievement. The station's experimental fusion reactor had suffered what engineers like to call a cascading containment failure, which was a polite way of saying it was trying very hard to turn into a small star. The automated systems were shutting down sections of the station to prevent total annihilation, but this had created a maze of locked blast doors, compromised corridors, and areas where the air itself had become actively hostile to continued existence. The nursery wing wasn't just inaccessible. It was rapidly becoming uninhabitable. The structural fires were spreading, the life support was failing, and the access routes were filling with a delightful cocktail of superheated gases and toxic combustion byproducts that would kill most life forms in minutes. Fletcher, to his credit, was frantically working his communicator, trying to coordinate with the evacuation teams and emergency response units. Unfortunately, he was doing it with the kind of panicked efficiency that suggested he was more concerned with following proper protocols than with actually solving the problem. Gorth, meanwhile, was studying the station schematics on the wall display with the focused intensity of someone planning a military assault. "Here," he said, pointing with one clawed finger. "Emergency maintenance shaft. It bypasses the main corridors." Nia looked at the route he'd traced and felt her heart sink. That shaft runs directly past the reactor housing. The radiation levels alone would kill a human in minutes, Gorth finished. Solarith are more resilient. I can survive the journey. Maybe, Nia admitted reluctantly. But even if you make it to the nursery, how do you get the cubs out? They're not going to follow you through a radioactive death trap, and you can't carry all 5 of them at once. Gorth's expression suggested he was perfectly willing to try. Logic be damned. Which was admirable in its way, but also likely to result in 6 dead Solareth instead of 5, and Nia's scientific mind rebelled against such inefficient problem-solving. There has to be another way, she muttered, studying the schematics. Her brain was already working on the problem, analyzing variables and calculating possibilities with the kind of methodical precision that had gotten her through years of fieldwork in environments designed to kill her. The thing about humans, she reflected as she traced alternate routes through the station's infrastructure, was that they had a tendency to survive in places where they had no business being alive. It was one of their most irritating traits from an evolutionary perspective. While other species had developed sensible adaptations like enhanced strength, natural armor, or the ability to photosynthesize, humans had somehow stumbled their way to the top of the food chain through a combination of dumb luck, stubborn persistence, and an apparent inability to recognize when they were supposed to be dead. Which gave her a very stupid idea. "Commander Willis," she said, keying her communicator, "I need detailed atmospheric readings for the route from here to Section 12. Specifically, I need to know about carbon monoxide concentrations, particulate density, and thermal gradients." "Doctor, this isn't the time for scientific curiosity. Just get me the readings," Nia interrupted. "And I need them now." While they waited, Gorth continued his examination of the station layout, his tactical mind clearly working through various assault scenarios. Fletcher was coordinating with the evacuation teams, though from what Nia could overhear, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. The cascade failure was spreading, and they had maybe 30 minutes before the entire station became uninhabitable. The atmospheric readings, when they came through, confirmed what Nia had suspected. The route to Section 12 was a death trap by any reasonable standard, filled with toxic gases, superheated air, and enough ambient radiation to turn most organic matter into glowing paste. For a Solareth, it was probably survivable, but barely. For a human, it should have been instantly fatal. Should have been. "Gorth," she said quietly, "I think I can get to your cubs." The War Prime turned to stare at her with an expression that suggested she'd just announced her intention to juggle live grenades. "Human, you would not survive the first corridor. Your species is weak, soft." "Our species," Nia interrupted, "has a really annoying habit of not dying when we're supposed to. Do you know what carbon monoxide poisoning is? A method by which lesser species remove themselves from the gene pool? A toxin that binds to hemoglobin more readily than oxygen, causing cellular suffocation," Nia corrected. "Most species have a very low tolerance for it. Humans, on the other hand, developed around cooking fires and enclosed spaces for thousands of generations. We have an unusually high tolerance for carbon monoxide and similar toxins. It's one of our few actually useful evolutionary adaptations." Gorth's ears flattened against his skull. "You propose to walk through poison that would kill a Solareth warrior?" "I propose to walk through poison that would inconvenience a human with a decent respirator," Nia said. "The thermal readings are more problematic, but humans also have surprisingly good heat tolerance when properly motivated, and the radiation levels, while unpleasant, aren't immediately lethal for short-term exposure." Fletcher had stopped his frantic coordination efforts and was staring at her with the kind of horror usually reserved for natural disasters. "Nia, you can't be serious. The liability alone—" "Fletcher," she said patiently, "shut up. The adults are talking." She turned back to Gorth, who was studying her with a new kind of intensity. "War Prime, I need you to understand something. This is probably going to kill me. The chances of success are marginal at best, but marginal is better than zero, which is what we're looking at otherwise." "Why?" Gorth asked simply. "They are not your cubs. You owe them nothing." Nia considered the question. Why was she even considering this insane rescue attempt? The rational answer was that successful evacuation of the cubs would significantly improve human-Solareth relations and potentially prevent a war that humanity was nowhere near ready to fight. The political implications were enormous. But if she was being honest with herself, the real reason was much simpler. Because someone needed to, and she was apparently the only one stupid enough to try. "Because," she said finally, "somebody has to, and I'm the only one here with the right combination of scientific knowledge and catastrophically poor judgment." Gorth made a sound that might have been laughter if it hadn't sounded quite so much like a death rattle. "Scholar who walks with predators, you are either very brave or very foolish." "Probably both," Nia admitted, "but that's never stopped me before." The evacuation protocols kicked in with all the smooth efficiency of a rusty bureaucratic machine having a nervous breakdown. Warning klaxons blared through the corridors while automated voices cheerfully informed everyone that they were about to die. But please remember to walk, don't run, to the nearest escape pod. The artificial gravity fluctuated wildly, making the simple act of walking feel like a poorly choreographed dance with physics. Nia found herself pressed against the corridor wall as evacuation teams rushed past, their faces grim behind emergency respirators. The mathematics of the situation were brutally simple. Too many people, not enough escape pods, and a rapidly shrinking window of time before the station's fusion reactor decided to demonstrate what happened when matter and energy had a really enthusiastic disagreement. "Doctor," Fletcher grabbed her arm as she moved toward the equipment lockers. "You cannot be serious about this rescue attempt. The diplomatic ramifications alone—" "Fletcher," Nia said, shaking him off, "I'm going to need you to prioritize. Would you rather explain to Earth Command why we lost a peace treaty, or why we let 5 alien children burn to death while we stood around calculating political implications?" Fletcher's face went through several interesting color changes. But the protocols clearly state that in emergency situations, human personnel take precedence. "The protocols," Gorth rumbled from behind them, "were written by cowards who have never faced real loss." The war prime had armed himself with what appeared to be a maintenance tool that looked suspiciously like it could double as a weapon. "Scholar who walks with predators speaks wisdom. Action over words, courage over comfort." Nia was busy pulling emergency gear from the supply locker: a basic atmospheric suit, a portable respirator rated for toxic environments, and enough emergency medical supplies to treat someone who'd been stupid enough to walk through a burning space station. The gear wasn't designed for this kind of insanity, but it was better than nothing. "War Prime," she said, testing the seal on her respirator, "I need you to understand something. If I don't make it back, this rescue attempt fails completely. You cannot follow me. The corridor I'm taking is barely survivable for a human. It would kill you in minutes." Gorth's expression suggested he was struggling with concepts that went against every instinct his species had evolved. Solareth were pack hunters, family protectors, beings who faced danger together rather than sending others into harm's way. The idea of standing back while someone else risked their life for his cubs was clearly causing him physical pain. "There must be another way," he growled. "I am War Prime. I do not send others to fight my battles." "This isn't a battle," Nia replied, checking her suit's power levels. "This is a very complicated form of stupidity that happens to require human-specific biological adaptations. Think of it as evolutionary specialization." The station shuddered around them as another section depressurized. Commander Willis's voice crackled through the emergency comm system. "All personnel, we have 15 minutes until mandatory evacuation. Repeat, 15 minutes to final departure. 15 minutes. Nia did some quick mental calculations and felt her stomach drop. The route to Section 12 would take at least 20 minutes under normal conditions. Through burning, toxic corridors with failing life support, it might take much longer, if it was even possible at all. "Scholar," Gorth said quietly, "why do you do this? Your own species would abandon my cubs to preserve themselves. Why do you risk everything for beings you barely know?" Nia paused in her equipment check. It was a fair question, and she wasn't entirely sure she had a good answer. The rational response would be to cite diplomatic necessity, political advantage, or species survival. But standing there in the flickering emergency lighting, watching Gorth struggle with helpless desperation, she realized the truth was much simpler and much more human. "Because they're kids," she said finally, "and because someone has to try." It wasn't a particularly sophisticated answer, but it seemed to satisfy something in Gorth's alien psychology. His ears came forward slightly, a sign of respect, according to her field notes. "If you succeed," he said formally, "you will be den mother to my line. This is not an honor given lightly. And if I fail, then I will remember that a human died trying to save Solarith cubs, and I will make sure my people know of your courage." Fletcher was frantically working his communicator, trying to coordinate with the rescue teams. "Doctor, the emergency crews report that Section 8 is completely inaccessible. The blast doors have sealed, and there's massive structural damage. Even if you reach the Cubs, how do you plan to get them out?" Nia studied the station schematics on her suit's display. Fletcher was right. The direct route back would be impossible. But there were maintenance shafts, emergency access tunnels, and several routes that might work if she was very lucky and very stupid. "Emergency shaft Delta 9, she said, tracing a path with her finger. "It connects to the main evacuation corridor about 200 meters from the escape pods. It's narrow. It's not designed for this kind of traffic, and it probably violates about 15 safety regulations." "Probably?" Fletcher's voice went up an octave. "Definitely," Nia corrected. "But it's also our only option." She sealed her atmospheric suit and activated the respirator. The world suddenly became smaller, filtered through the helmet's display and the steady hiss of recycled air. Her suit's sensors immediately began cataloging the atmospheric conditions in the corridor: elevated carbon monoxide levels, particulate contamination, and thermal readings that made her glad she couldn't feel the actual temperature. "Scholar who walks with predators," Gorth said, and there was something almost ceremonial in his tone. "May the hunt favor you." "Thanks," Nia replied. "If I don't make it back, try not to start a war over this, okay? Earth's insurance premiums are already ridiculous." She sealed her helmet and stepped into the corridor leading towards Section 12. The first thing that hit her was the heat. Even through the suit's thermal protection, she could feel the air temperature climbing as she moved deeper into the station. The walls were warm to the touch, and her suit's sensors painted increasingly alarming readouts across her helmet display. Carbon monoxide levels that would kill most species in minutes, particulate matter thick enough to choke an industrial air filter, and radiation readings that suggested she was going to glow in the dark for the next few weeks. The corridor looked like something from a nightmare. Emergency lighting cast everything in hellish red shadows, and smoke hung in the air like toxic fog. Sections of the wall paneling had buckled from the heat, creating a maze of twisted metal and exposed wiring. The floor was hot enough that she could feel it through her boots. "Well," she muttered to herself, "this is definitely going on my list of poor life choices." She'd gone maybe 50 meters when the first blast door loomed ahead of her. A massive barrier of reinforced metal that had sealed automatically when the emergency protocols engaged. According to her suit's schematics, there should be a maintenance override panel somewhere nearby. She found it behind a section of collapsed ceiling, its access cover half melted from the heat. The manual release required a combination of codes and physical manipulation that was clearly designed by someone who'd never tried to operate it while wearing bulky gloves and breathing recycled air. The door ground open with a sound like mechanical agony, revealing the corridor beyond. If the first section had been unpleasant, this was actively hostile. The air itself seemed to shimmer with heat distortion, and her suit's radiation warnings began flashing with increasing urgency. 15% increase in ambient radiation, her suit's AI informed her in a cheerfully clinical voice. Recommend immediate evacuation to safe distance. Noted and ignored, Nia replied, stepping through the doorway. The next section of corridor was where things got really interesting. A plasma conduit had ruptured somewhere overhead, sending cascades of superheated gas down through the ventilation system. The air was thick with toxic fumes, and visibility dropped to maybe 3 meters. Her suit's air supply was working overtime to keep her breathing something that wouldn't immediately kill her. She made it another 100 meters before encountering the next obstacle. a section where the floor had partially collapsed, leaving a gap about 2 meters wide. Below, she could see the twisted wreckage of what had been the deck below, now a maze of twisted metal and sparking electrical systems. "Oh, come on," she muttered. "Really?" The gap was just wide enough to be problematic, but not quite wide enough to be impossible. With a running jump, she could probably make it. Probably. The alternative was turning back, and that wasn't really an option. She backed up, took a deep breath of recycled air, and ran. For a moment, she was flying through superheated, toxic air, her suit's systems screaming warnings about atmospheric conditions that would kill her if she lingered. Then she hit the far edge of the gap, rolled, and kept moving. 200 meters to Section 12, her suit informed her. Warning: life support efficiency declining due to environmental contamination. 200 meters. In normal conditions, that was maybe 2 minutes of walking. In these conditions, it felt like a marathon through hell's own obstacle course. The corridor ahead was a disaster zone. Sections of the ceiling had collapsed, leaving twisted metal obstacles that forced her to crawl through spaces barely wider than her suit. Electrical fires cast dancing shadows on the walls, and the smell of burning insulation leaked through her respirator's filters. She was halfway through a particularly narrow gap when her suit's proximity alarms started screaming. Something was wrong with the structural integrity directly ahead. The corridor was shifting, settling, on the verge of complete collapse. She had maybe 30 seconds before several tons of twisted metal came down on her head. Nia did what humans do best in impossible situations. She ignored the odds and kept moving. She squeezed through the gap with a speed that would have been impressive if it hadn't been motivated by sheer terror, rolled under a falling support beam, and somehow emerged on the far side just as the entire section came down behind her. Her suit's damage assessment was not encouraging. Multiple seal breaches, thermal protection compromised, and life support systems operating at 60% efficiency. She was running out of time, air, and luck in roughly equal measure. But ahead of her, through the smoke and chaos, she could see the entrance to Section 12. And from somewhere beyond that entrance, she could hear the sound of 5 very frightened, very young Solareth cubs calling for help. The Vraiter entrance to Section 12 looked like it had been designed by someone with a grudge against structural engineering and a passion for creative destruction. The blast door hung at an angle, its frame twisted from thermal expansion, leaving a gap just wide enough for a determined human to squeeze through. Beyond it, the nursery wing was a hellscape of smoke, sparking electronics, and the occasional shower of sparks from overhead conduits that had given up any pretense of following safety regulations. Nia's suit sensors were painting a picture that would have sent any rational person running in the opposite direction. The air was thick with particulates that could charitably be described as aggressively toxic. The temperature was approaching levels that would make a furnace operator nervous, and the structural integrity of the entire section was rated somewhere between questionable and "you've got to be kidding me." Life support at 40% efficiency, her suit's AI announced, with the kind of cheerful optimism usually reserved for funeral directors. Recommend immediate evacuation to safer environment. Recommendation noted and filed under "not happening," Nia muttered, squeezing through the gap. The nursery wing had been decorated in what could generously be called post-apocalyptic daycare. What had once been a carefully designed space for young Solareth, complete with climbing structures, comfortable sleeping areas, and educational displays, now resembled the aftermath of a small war. The climbing structures had collapsed into twisted metal sculptures. The sleeping areas were filled with acrid smoke, and the educational displays were providing a very effective lesson in What happens when everything goes wrong at once? The sound that had drawn her here, the distressed calls of 5 young Solareth, was coming from somewhere deeper in the section. Following the sound meant navigating a maze of fallen debris, sparking electrical systems, and air that was probably violating several interstellar environmental protection statutes. Nia found them huddled together in what had once been a reading nook, now transformed into a makeshift shelter behind an overturned table. 5 cubs, each about the size of a large dog, but with the kind of natural weaponry that made large dogs look like stuffed animals. They were beautiful in their own alien way. Silver-gray fur that shimmered even in the emergency lighting, intelligent golden eyes that tracked her movement, and the kind of innate grace that suggested they'd grow up to be apex predators if they lived long enough. Which, at the moment, was looking increasingly unlikely. The cubs were in various stages of distress. 2 were unconscious, overcome by smoke inhalation. The other 3 were awake, but clearly struggling, their breathing labored and their movements sluggish. They watched Nia approach with a mixture of fear and desperate hope that was almost heartbreaking. "Well," she said to herself, "this is the part where I find out if my xenobiology training actually means anything." According to her research, young Solareth responded to specific vocalizations and scent markers that indicated safety and family. Adult Solareth could recognize these signals across species, but cubs were more selective. She'd spent months learning the proper sounds and movements, though she'd never imagined using them in quite these circumstances. She crouched down, keeping her movements slow and non-threatening, and made a low, rumbling sound deep in her throat, the Solareth equivalent of, "Everything's okay. The adults are here." It was harder to do through a respirator, but apparently close enough, because the conscious cubs perked up immediately. One of them, slightly larger than the others, probably the eldest, made a questioning chirp. Nia responded with the appropriate reassurance sound, then slowly extended her hand toward them. The eldest cub sniffed at her glove, then made a sound that she recognized as surprise. Even through the atmospheric suit, she apparently still carried enough scent markers from her time on Solareth Prime to register as safe adult who knows what she's doing. Which was fortunate, because she definitely didn't know what she was doing. "Okay, kids," she said softly. "We're going to play a fun game called Don't Die in a Space Station Fire. The rules are simple. Stay close to me, do what I do, and try not to panic when everything goes completely insane." The cubs, of course, didn't understand a word she was saying, but her tone seemed to calm them. The conscious ones gathered closer, while she checked on the 2 who'd succumbed to smoke inhalation. Still breathing, but barely. They needed medical attention, and they needed it soon. The problem was logistics. 5 cubs, each weighing approximately 30 kilograms, through a burning space station via maintenance shafts and emergency corridors that weren't designed for this kind of traffic. Even if they were all conscious and mobile, it would be challenging. With 2 unconscious and the others weakened by smoke exposure, it was moving rapidly from challenging to mathematically impossible. Nia's scientific mind began working on the problem with the kind of methodical precision that had gotten her through years of field work. Weight distribution, carrying capacity, route optimization, time constraints, all variables that needed to be balanced against the reality that her life support was failing and the station was actively trying to kill them all. She stripped off her emergency pack and began improvising a carrying system using the pack's straps, her utility belt, and several pieces of fabric torn from her suit's outer layer. The result looked like something a deranged engineer might design for transporting moderately cooperative wildlife, but it should distribute the weight evenly enough to make carrying the cubs possible. The unconscious cubs went into the makeshift harness first, secured against her back and sides. The conscious ones she encouraged to climb onto her shoulders and arms, using a combination of vocalizations and gentle manipulation to get them positioned where they could hold on during movement. The final arrangement made her look like a human-shaped jungle gym with fur. 5 young Solareth clinging to various parts of her body, their claws carefully positioned to avoid puncturing her suit's life support systems. It was uncomfortable, unwieldy, and probably violated several dozen safety regulations. It was also her only option. "Right," she said, testing her balance. "Let's see if this insane plan actually works." The journey back was immediately and comprehensively worse than the journey in. Her modified load distribution meant she had to navigate obstacles differently, squeezing through gaps that were barely wide enough for one person, let alone one person carrying 5 alien children. The cubs, to their credit, seemed to understand the gravity of the situation and held on with impressive determination. The first real test came at the collapsed corridor section. The gap that she'd jumped across during her inward journey now looked approximately 3 times wider with her modified cargo. There was no way she could make the jump with 5 cubs attached to her. "Time for Plan B," she muttered, then realized she didn't actually have a Plan B. She spent precious minutes working her way around the collapsed section, finding a route through twisted wreckage and partially sealed emergency doors. Her suit's life support was down to 28% efficiency. Her air supply was running low, and she could feel the cubs growing weaker from continued smoke exposure. But they were still alive, still holding on, and somehow she was still moving forward. The next crisis came at the section boundary, where the blast door she'd manually opened on the way in had partially closed again. The gap was now barely wide enough for her to squeeze through alone, much less with her current configuration of passengers. She tried to reopen the door, but the manual controls had been damaged by heat and smoke. The override panel was a melted ruin, and the emergency release mechanism was jammed solid. "This is the point," she informed the cubs, "where any sensible person would give up and wait for rescue. Fortunately for you, humans are not particularly sensible." She managed to work one of the unconscious cubs through the gap, then used her body to force the door open just enough to squeeze the rest of them through. The process left her with several new tiers in her suit and a life support efficiency rating that was now officially classified as optimistic. The final stretch to the evacuation corridor felt like it took hours, though her suit's chronometer insisted it had only been minutes. Her modified carrying system was holding together through a combination of engineering principles and sheer, bloody-minded determination. But the cubs were getting heavier with each step, and her own strength was beginning to fail. She could hear voices ahead, rescue teams, evacuation coordinators, the blessed sound of other humans who weren't currently trying to carry 5 alien children through a burning space station. She rounded the corner into the main evacuation corridor and immediately found herself the center of attention. "Medical team to Corridor 9 Alpha," someone was shouting. "We've got casualties, multiple species, severe smoke inhalation." "Is that Dr. Nia?" Fletcher's voice, pitched high with disbelief. "Where did she—" "Long story," Nia said, carefully lowering herself to the deck so the medical teams could access the cubs. "Short version: human stupidity proves surprisingly effective when applied with sufficient determination." The evacuation teams swarmed around her with professional efficiency, separating the cubs from her improvised carrying system and beginning immediate medical treatment. The 2 unconscious cubs were placed on emergency life support, while the others were given oxygen therapy and antitoxin treatments. Gorth appeared as if by magic, his massive frame pushing through the crowd of rescue personnel. He looked at his cubs, alive, breathing, being treated by competent medical staff, then at Nia, who was sitting on the deck, looking like she'd been through a particularly aggressive industrial accident. "Scholar who walks with predators," he said, and his voice carried tones she'd never heard from a Solareth before. "You have given me back my future." "Just returning the favor," Nia replied, pulling off her helmet and immediately regretting it, as the corridor's smoke-tainted air hit her lungs. "Your people taught me a lot about survival. Seemed only fair to put it to good use." Fletcher was staring at her with the kind of expression usually reserved for natural phenomena that defied explanation. "Doctor, what you've just accomplished is... the odds against success were really terrible," Nia agreed. "But that's never stopped humans before, and apparently it's not going to start now." One of the medical techs was running scans on her suit's atmospheric readings. "Doctor, according to these readings, you were exposed to levels of carbon monoxide and thermal radiation that should have been lethal. How are you still conscious?" Nia considered the question. "Humans," she said finally, "have a really annoying habit of not dying when they're supposed to. We're like the galaxy's most persistent weeds." The evacuation proceeded with remarkable efficiency after that. The cubs were stable, the rescue teams had everyone accounted for, and the escape pods were launching in orderly sequence. Nia found herself assigned to the same pod as Gorth and his cubs, which meant she got to spend the journey to the rescue ships listening to young Solareth make the kind of contented sounds that suggested they'd decided she was acceptable pack material. As they pulled away from the station, she watched through the viewport as the facility's fusion reactor finally gave up its struggle with physics. The explosion was visible even through the pod's radiation shielding, a brief, brilliant star that marked the end of humanity's first formal diplomatic station. "Well," she said to no one in particular, "that could have gone better." Gorth's laugh rumbled through the small pod. "Scholar who walks with predators, you have much to learn about Solareth definitions of success." The medical bay of the rescue ship looked like a cross between a veterinary clinic and a disaster relief center, which was probably appropriate given the circumstances. Nia found herself in a diagnostic bed, connected to various monitoring devices that were painting a cheerfully alarming picture of someone who'd recently decided to take a stroll through conditions that should have been instantly fatal. The cubs were in the adjacent treatment area, all 5 of them stable and recovering. The 2 who'd been unconscious were responding well to treatment, while the other 3 had apparently decided that the human who'd carried them to safety was now part of their pack. They'd arranged themselves around her bed like furry, clawed bodyguards, occasionally making contented rumbling sounds that the medical staff found either adorable or mildly terrifying. Dr. Mitchell, the ship's chief medical officer, was studying her test results with the kind of fascination usually reserved for particularly interesting diseases. "Your carbon monoxide levels should have put you in a coma," he said. "Your thermal exposure readings suggest you should have third-degree burns over 60% of your body. And the radiation dosage..." He shook his head. "I'm going to need to completely revise my understanding of human physiological limits." "Humans are full of surprises," Nia replied, gently scratching behind the ears of the cub who'd claimed the spot next to her pillow. "We specialize in surviving things that should kill us and then complaining about the inconvenience." Fletcher appeared in the doorway, looking like someone who'd spent the last few hours having his worldview systematically demolished. "Doctor, I've just finished debriefing with War Prime Gorth. There's something you need to know about the negotiations." "Let me guess," Nia said wearily. "They weren't actually Negotiations. How did you— Fletcher started, then stopped. The entire scenario was a test. Not the station malfunction, that was genuinely accidental, but the Solareth response to it, their evaluation of human character under pressure. Gorth's massive frame filled the medical bay entrance. Forgive the deception, scholar who walks with predators. My people needed to know if humans could be trusted as allies or merely tolerated as trade partners. And the cubs are truly my offspring, and truly were in danger. The test was not in the crisis itself, but in how your species would respond to it. Gorth moved to stand beside her bed, his golden eyes serious. Many species talk of honor and courage. Few demonstrate it when the cost becomes personal. So, what's the verdict? The negotiations are concluded, Gorth announced formally. Any species that would risk one of their own to save the young of former enemies, without thought of reward or political advantage, is worthy of our respect. You are no longer potential allies. You are family. Nia blinked. Wait, so I accidentally diplomacy-ed us into an alliance by being spectacularly reckless. The highest form of Solareth diplomacy, Gorth confirmed solemnly. Actions over words, courage over calculation. Fletcher looked like he was still processing this information. So, the peace treaty is unnecessary, Gorth said. We do not make treaties with family. We make bonds that transcend politics. One of the cubs, the eldest, who'd been first to trust her, climbed onto the bed and settled against her side with a satisfied rumble. According to Solareth custom, Gorth explained, she was now considered a den mother to his line, which came with certain responsibilities and privileges that would take approximately 3 hours to fully explain. So let me get this straight, Nia said, as the other cubs began rearranging themselves for maximum comfort on and around her bed. I nearly died, lost most of my equipment, probably glowed in the dark for the next month, and now I'm legally responsible for feeding and educating 5 teenage apex predators. And this is considered a good outcome? The best possible outcome, Gorth confirmed, though you may find the cubs' dietary requirements challenging. Nia looked down at the 5 young Solareth who'd apparently adopted her as their secondary parent, then at the monitoring equipment that was still trying to figure out how she was alive, then at Fletcher, who was frantically taking notes about interspecies adoption protocols. You know what? She said finally. I've had worse jobs. The cubs made harmonious purring sounds. The medical equipment continued its optimistic beeping, and somewhere in the distance she could hear Fletcher trying to explain to Earth Command why the peace negotiations had concluded with their xenobiologist accidentally becoming part of an alien family. Just another day in the life of a human who was too stubborn to die when she was supposed to.